Okay, so now we've touched base on the parties and what they were doing. Let's talk about a few of the presidents, at least at the beginning of the Gilded Age. The first one, we've already talked about him before, is Ohioan from Delaware, Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes. One thing I'll say about the Gilded Age is we have several presidents from Ohio elected during this time period. So Hayes from Delaware. Remember, he won the disputed election of 1876 when him and Tilden were one electoral vote apart, and Tilden in the three former Confederate disputed states probably would have won at least one of them, if not all three of them, but the votes were disputed, and they come to the compromise that all three states would vote for Hayes, and in return, Hayes and the Republicans would end Reconstruction in the South, and basically, that's when Jim Crow started. That's when a lot of the things that you all read and outlined in the last chapter with Jim Crow laws in the New South started. It was because of Hayes, and not a great president. He and his wife Lucy, aka Lemonade Lucy, were in favor of temperance. Again, the Republicans become the party of temperance and eventually the party of prohibition, and they banned liquor in the White House. And that's where the nickname Lemonade Lucy comes from, because it was said that all she would serve was water and lemonade in the White House. Hayes' presidency, which we've discussed in the past, and so I don't want to go too much into it right now, not a great presidency, and pretty much not a lot of good happens, not a lot of bad happens. The one kind of bright spot is that he did veto the Chinese immigration laws that had been attempted to be passed. Ultimately, the Exclusion Act does come back around, but Hayes did try to prevent Chinese discrimination from happening. The next president who wins the election of 1880 is James Garfield. He wins the Republican nomination after Hayes chose to only serve one term. He said that he was only going to be a one-term president, and he lived up to it. He defeats Winfield Scott Hancock in a very close election in 1880. Winfield Scott Hancock, for those of you that don't remember, was a Civil War general wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg. Tried to prevent the massacre that happened at Fredericksburg by trying to get across the river early, and Ambrose Burnside wouldn't let him. But he runs as the Democratic nominee in a very, very competitive election. But ultimately, Garfield and the Republicans are able to eke out a victory. He's a member, Garfield, of the half-breed faction, meaning that he was on the side of James G. Blaine, and he gives all patronage jobs during his presidency to other half-breeds. And the reason why this is important is because it causes issues with Conkling's stalwarts. And it really becomes an issue in 1881 when Garfield is boarding a train in Buffalo, New York, and he is shot and killed by a stalwart who was, disgruntled because he had tried to get a government job. He had been denied, and so, he was obviously a madman, a deranged madman, but he was an upset stalwart Republican who tried to get a government job and was denied because he wasn't a member of the half-breeds. His name was Charles Guiteau. And so Guiteau shoots and kills James Garfield in 1881, and his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, succeeds him. Again, this is the second presidential assassination in American history, the fourth time a president has died while in office. So Arthur becomes the fourth vice president to ascend or become the president. Again, he was Garfield's vice president. He supported a bill reforming the civil service. Remember, that's the way that we pick people that get government jobs. It's called the civil service. Anyone who works in a government job in the modern day has to take a civil service test. I believe I've talked about this with you all in the past. I talked about my experience when I got my job for the city of Columbus, when I was a call center manager, and I had to go in and take a test and go through a whole litany of things about how I would react to certain situations, take fake phone calls, things like that. That was my civil service exam. And again, Garfield supports those, and they're widely used in the modern day. Because of his support for that, it expands the number of government employees who are hired not because of their ability. Let me rephrase that. Not because of their party affiliation, but because of their ability. And so he is the first president to really change from the patronage system, not wholeheartedly and not completely, but he begins the process of more hires because of ability and not because of patronage. He expands our modern Navy. He begins to question the high protective tariffs. So in many ways, he is not a dedicated, hardcore Republican, I guess, for this time. He definitely is kind of an older kind of version of the Republican Party. And because of this, he is denied the party's nomination in 1884, and so he is unable to run for re-election. So again, Garfield assassinated less than 2 years into his term, little over a year actually into his term. Arthur takes over, serves out the term, but is not nominated for the party's nomination in 1884. And so you can start to see how these presidents are very short-lived and very ineffective. Okay, so we know that the presidents of this era, not great, not effective, not memorable. Congress in this Gilded Age is not much better. You know, we talked about this before with the early 1800s, how the presidents, largely forgettable, people like John Tyler and William Henry Harrison and Millard Fillmore and Martin Van Buren, people like that, very forgettable. But we talked about how the Congress of that time, people like Henry Clay, who you all know I love so much, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, Charles Sumner, et cetera, eventually Stephen A. Douglas, are all very memorable. Well, the Congress of this era is not. They're largely unremarkable, just like the presidents were. Many served extremely long terms. In the case of John Sherman of Ohio, William Tecumseh Sherman's brother, he served from 1855 to 1898 with only really one major accomplishment. The Sherman Antitrust Act being the one major thing he did. He did a few other little things that we'll talk about later, but the one big thing was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was very ineffective until Teddy Roosevelt's president, long after he is gone, John Sherman, from Congress and from this world, unfortunately for him. That's just one example of the many. There are a couple of people who seemed as if they could have been factors in national politics. Thomas Czar Reed of Maine became Speaker of the House and instituted a very autocratic rule over the House, meaning he made the rules very stringent. He made it very hard for the people that weren't in his faction, on his side, to get or gain any kind of ground or put up any kind of major bills. He basically ruled the House with an iron fist. It took many years to break that. And then on the other side, in the Senate, James G. Blaine had, the potential to be great. Again, he is the leader of the half-breed faction. He reforms the Republican Party, though, from an anti-slavery party to the well-organized pro-business party that it became. And as he is on his rise, unfortunately, his tie, his link, his association with some scandals, specifically a few railroad scandals and some other corrupt issues in his past, tarnished his reputation and pretty much blunted his rise. And he's never a force really in presidential politics. And believe me when I tell you that James G. Blaine's aspirations were much larger than what they ended up being. Okay, so let's end today's lecture with the election of 1884. The Republicans, again, chose not to nominate Chester A. Arthur, the president, the vice president who would become president, and they actually chose to give James G. Blaine his shot at the presidency. But like I said before, his association with corruption ruined his chances of winning this election. When the mugwumps, again, the people that sat both sides of the fence, chose to ignore and not vote Republican in this election, but actually vote for the Democratic nominee rather than the half-breed James G. Blaine because of that corruption. So this is an example of where they were trying to play both sides of the fence. They didn't like the side, the person that the one side chose, and so they didn't just go to the other side. They went completely to the other party. The Democrats nominate Grover Cleveland. He was the former mayor of the city of Buffalo in upstate New York, a rising industrial kind of beacon in the northern state of New York on Lake Erie, near the American-Canadian border. He also had been the governor of New York State. And the three kind of characteristics that he had that were the polar opposite, at least of the perception of James G. Blaine, were that he was honest, he was frugal, and he was conscientious, meaning he told the truth. He was frugal, meaning he was good with money, he didn't waste money, and he was conscientious. He thought about others. This campaign is very dirty, okay? The Republican Party questioned the fact that Grover Cleveland had fathered a child out of wedlock. And, in the modern day, this is not as big of an issue. This was something that at that time could have been a big disqualifier for you. As a matter of fact, I was just recently watching on Netflix a show called The English Game. It's about the kind of beginning of soccer being a professional sport. And it focuses on late 1800s, I think it was 1880. So right around this same time, the Gilded Age in America, but in England, and how having a child out of wedlock could really ruin, especially a woman's life at the time, but also a man's life at the time. It was kind of if you're familiar with the book The Scarlet Letter for adultery, but kind of like a scarlet letter for that era. The Republicans also labeled the Democratic Party the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. They, try to, again, wave the bloody shirt by bringing up rebellion of the South during the Confederacy. They brought up Romanism because, again, most of their supporters were Protestants. They were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And again, they brought up the issue of rum because, again, they are the party of temperance. This may have backfired on them. Because the reality is that the high voter turnout of Catholics in this election, especially in states like New York and other northern industrial states, New York, Pennsylvania, etc., helped elect Cleveland as the first Democratic president since James Buchanan was elected in 1856. Now, we all remember how James Buchanan was as president of the United States, and in my opinion, he is definitely in the bottom 2 or 3. I would probably rank him as the worst president of all time, but I think Andrew Johnson has a good, argument there too. But yeah, James Buchanan, the last Democrat to win before Grover Cleveland. So we will end our lectures there for today. We'll pick up tomorrow with the presidency of Grover Cleveland. I hope you all are doing well. I hope to see you all in our Zoom meetings. And if you have questions, make sure you reach out to me. Have a great day, everybody.